Welcome to Philosophy and Critical Thinking, the basics. In our last video, we talked about ad hominems and appealing to authority. In this video, we're going to be talking about arguments from analogy and thought experiments. So analogies are when we say one thing is similar to another thing. We're using two different things and contrasting them with one another to show how they're similar. Consider this statement. Lying about how much money you owe your friend is just like cheating on your taxes. So when we're looking at this, the person's saying that there's no difference between the two. When we're talking about the similarities between these two things, they're called the analogies, because that's talking about the similarities. If we're going to talk about what's different between these two things, they're called disanalogies. So if somebody is saying that it's disanalogous, or that there are disanalogies between the proposed analogy like above, we're claiming that the analogy is false, that there are things that are different about it which make them not an analogy. So if someone wanted to say, well, it's just like cheating on your taxes, say, well, no, one's going to the government, the other one's trying to pay back your friends, and that's the difference. So you can show that it's not just like cheating on your taxes, so it's disanalogous. So if you tried to make the argument like this, it won't hold up. It's going to be shown to be false very quickly. So when we do make arguments from analogy, there's a preconceived assumption that we're not saying that the two things are exactly the same in every way. Like that'd be like saying cheating like your taxes is just like cheating on your taxes, and that's not how we use analogies. We take it for granted that there are going to be some differences between the two. So what is really being argued in an analogy that there are no relevant differences in contrast to a conclusion. So what this means is that the parts where they're similar are what matter in what we're trying to argue. So we're trying to argue for something, and we're using the analogy to say between these two things that there are no relevant differences, that the differences that are in there are just arbitrary. So so you're looking for the relevant differences. So in this case, when we say it's analogous, we're not saying that there are no differences at all, but there are no relevant differences. And to say if it's disanalogous is to say that there are relevant differences. So to make an argument from analogy valid, we can apply the logical form here. We'll start with premise 1 that A is B. So one kind of thing, A, is it has some kind of property B. For premise 2, we put there are no relevant differences between A and C regarding them being B. So what this means here is that you've got the one thing A, which has no differences or no relevant differences with C, and that both of them have B. Therefore, conclusion, C is B. So this is valid because if it's true that A is B, and that the analogy between A and C, that there are no relevant differences, so they're exactly the same in regard to what's relevant to being B, it would have to be the case that C is also B. So that's how we can make an argument from analogy valid. So going back to our original argument about lying to your friend about how much money you owe them and cheating on your taxes, let's look at how we can apply this logical form to make a more compelling argument for this analogy. So we start with premise 1. Lying to a friend about how much money you owe them is wrong. So we're saying we'd all pretty much accept that. If you have a friend and you've borrowed money from them, or you promised them some money for some reason, and you were pretending like you had given back the money you actually owed them, but you actually knew that you owed them more than that, I'd say most of us would agree that's wrong. Premise 2, there are no relevant differences between lying to a friend about how much money you owe them and cheating on your taxes regarding it being wrong. Therefore, cheating on your taxes is wrong. So we can see this follows the same logical form as before. So we know it's valid. So we have to check to see if the argument's sound. So we established earlier that we'd probably say premise 1 is true. So we've got that true. So now we just got to figure out whether premise 2 is true. And this is where things can sometimes get a bit difficult, because we've got to figure out whether there are relevant differences between the two. Going back to the original time when we heard the argument, we pointed out the difference that one's lying to your friend about how much money you owe them, the other one's lying to the government, and it's talking about the person who you're doing the lying to. So some might say, well, that is a relevant difference. It's okay to lie to the government about how much money you owe them, but it's not okay to lie to a friend. So someone might say there is a relevant difference, but somebody else might hold a bit of a stronger moral view on this and say, well, no, in any case where you're lying to somebody about money that you owe them, you're doing the wrong thing. So that's why I'm trying to, that's the point I'm trying to push here. So yeah, sometimes there can be a bit of disagreement between people and between philosophers about what counts as relevant and what counts as not relevant regarding something being wrong. So but it's good to take this formula, because then you can see where the issues lie between an analogy. Whether you're going to accept an analogy or you're going to reject an analogy will be whether you can see differences between the analogy that you believe are relevant. So that's something to remember when analyzing an argument from an analogy. Arguments from analogy are quite common in a lot of philosophy and philosophical methods. And a lot of times the analogy that we'll be using will involve a imagined situation or a hypothetical situation which might not have occurred, or in some cases, can't really occur in this world, but in kind of in an imagined world. These are called thought experiments, very popular method in philosophy. In way we would use a thought experiment is normally used as a premise in an argument, or to set up a premise in an argument. They don't really work as arguments on their own. They're normally used to push forward some other argument. So you could have, in the previous example, the cheating on your taxes and lying to a friend. You could say, well, I've never done that, I've never experienced that, but you can imagine what it would be like if you did. Although that'd be a very simple thought experiment, it'd still operate as an thought experiment, because what's happening is we're trying to get you to use your imagination to come to a conclusion. So that's how thought experiments are used as a premise in an argument. As an argument from analogy, they are very common, but they're not limited to just arguments from analogy. You can do different arguments that involve thought experiments, and I'll show you some examples of that in our next slide. So there is a very popular thought experiment in philosophy which comes from Australian philosopher Peter Singer, and the thought experiment's this. If you're walking down a park one day and you saw a shallow pond, and in this shallow pond there was a child drowning in the pond, you would go and save that child as quickly as you can. You wouldn't waste any time. You'd go straight in there. Now imagine you're wearing some shoes you just bought, and they're worth a couple $100. You wouldn't consider wasting time by taking your shoes off to go and save the child, because that would further risk them from dying from the drowning. So you would go straight in there and save this child without taking your shoes off, because you don't care about the ruining of your shoes. You're more than happy to let your shoes get ruined to guarantee this child's survival, or to maximize the chance of the child's survival. What Singer does is uses this thought experiment to say that when regarding giving to charity, there's lots of charities out there that if you gave that same amount, say a year, or even just as a once-off. If you just did $200 as a once-off, depending on the charity, of course, but there are plenty of charities out there where it's pretty much guaranteed you'd save at least one child's life. That's pretty much is very probable, almost a certainty that with that amount of money and how much money it actually is really needed to save a child's life in certain areas in the third world, that's pretty much a certainty. So what he says that there's no relevant difference between rushing in to save the child, even though it'll wreck out $200 shoes and we'd have to spend a couple $100 to buy some new ones, and giving about $200 to charity. So he concludes from this that we should give to charity to save a child's life, just like we would rush in to save the child from the shallow pond. So that's the thought experiment. And as you can see, the thought experiment allows us to put into standard form the argument from analogy. Premise 1, we should save a child from drowning at the expense of our shoes. Premise 2, there is no relevant difference between saving a child from drowning at the expense of our shoes regarding giving to charity to save a child's life. Therefore, conclusion 3, we should give to charity to save a child's life. So that's how the thought experiment works. Now, there's lots of philosophers that find this very compelling and find the argument sound. There's some others out there that say no, there are relevant differences like distance. Do we have duties to those within our proximity, or are the duties the same from those far away from us halfway across the world? So there's some disputes there, but as we've mentioned before, that we all know that's where the dispute lies. But this is a very popular thought experiment which operates as an argument from analogy. This next thought experiment actually doesn't operate as an argument from analogy. It operates as a different kind of argument. And this is Robert Nozick's experience machine. Before we go into the thought experiment, in philosophy sometimes there's views about what counts as a good life. What is the good life? And some philosophers believe that the good life is a life where you've experienced the most amount of pleasure and the least amount of pain. So this is known as the hedonistic good life. So most amount of pleasure, least amount of pain. You've lived a good life. Nozick puts forward this experience machine as a thought experiment to address this hedonistic good life. The experience machine is, imagine if someone came up to you and said, we've got this experience machine, we can pop you into this machine for the rest of your life, and for the rest of your life you'll experience the most amount of pleasure you can possibly experience and no pain at all. So you're going to be the rest of your life completely full of pleasure and no pain, and the pleasures are going to be all the pleasures that you want, and there'll be nothing that you don't want. It's going to be absolute bliss for the rest of your life. We'll even wipe your memory so just that you went into the machine, so you're not missing the outside world. It'll be just as if you're living in the real world, but it's all going to be all the pleasures and none of the pain. Nozick believes that most of us would not want to go into this machine. He believes that we would instinctively want to live in the real world, even if that meant not having as much pleasure and having more pain than being in the experience machine. We're more than happy to have more pain and less pleasure being in the actual real world. So not many of us would want to take on this offer of going into the experience machine. So he uses this to say that the hedonistic view of the good life is wrong. Because if it was true that the hedonistic of the good life was true, then that's what we would want to do. We would want to live in the experience machine, but that's not what most of us would want to do. So if you put this into standard form, it follows the logical form of modus tollens. If we remember a few tutorials back, the modus tollens is how we can find something to be false by using a conditional. So we take a look here. If the hedonistic good life is true, then we'd want to live in the experience machine. So that's our if P then Q. Premise 2, we would not want to live in the experience machine, not Q. Therefore, the hedonistic good life is false, not P. So you can see how you can use thought experiments to draw conclusions by putting them into an argument. So this is another way a thought experiment can be used. If you want more information, you can go to the website on www.philosophycriticalthinking.com. If you want some more literature regarding thought experiments, I highly recommend two books. One is The Laboratory of the Mind by James Robert Brown and Introduction to Philosophical Methods by Chris Daly. They go over them pretty well. Next video is we're going to be focusing on deconstructing straw men and the principle of charity. So we're going to be going over how to help people when they're making mistakes or if they haven't made their arguments clear, and to help them make them more clear so we can try and get knowledge of the conclusion. If you want to stay on for more of these tutorials or want to stay informed with them, please subscribe and click the bell. Thanks.